Cool, this t-shirt's actually relevant today. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Nacht, Nimik Kon. Nacht is one of the main aliases for Lee Norris, also well known as Mathematics and Norkin, as well as his work in various collaboration projects such as Autumn of Communion, Moss Garden, The Ashes of Piemonte, Asterisk Gate, Ishkamatics, The Angling Loser, under his real name Lee Norris, and alongside Porya Hatami. Also more recently Memex and Orphic Signals as well, though I admittedly didn't realize he was in those before and haven't heard those particular projects yet. This guy is probably the single most prolific artist that I personally keep up with on a regular basis. He's released over 70 albums, including all those collaborations I've mentioned. I've tried my best to keep up with whatever he releases, and while I don't think I've yet heard everything he's put out, still got those two newer projects I mentioned earlier, and some Autumn of Communion projects that I haven't heard yet. Wanted to review the Metal album from AOC, but didn't get the time to before the year was out. I don't know. But whatever, I believe I am at least up to date on basically everything he released up through 2015? Maybe 2016. Maybe mid-2016. And it's a freaking ton of music. I've probably listened to 90% of what he's done. And I've been committed to his work because back in my middle school days, his stuff under the Mathematics name in particular was what initially got me into IDM, and still holds up amazingly well as some of my favorite stuff in that particular genre. Got a whole bunch of CDs right here. Guy left a really strong and lasting impact on me, to say the least. And Nacht is probably the most prolific of his solo aliases, especially in this decade. This is where he focuses on ambient material, but it's difficult to get much more specific than that, because the stuff he's released under this name falls under a fairly wide variety of sounds and styles. In fact, I think it's about time I pulled out a certain segment on this guy and go down his discography so far. Specifically just Nacht material. I'll do this on Mathematics and Norkin next time he releases some new music under those names. Kind of a collection of early tracks that's okay, but I haven't returned to a lot, mainly because some tracks reprise on his Broad Tape Band album. Check it out if you're curious, but it's nothing essential. I would say if you're going to start anywhere with Nacht, I would most recommend here, Seps Vents. Spooky, glitchy, ambient stuff that sounds very abstract, dark, tape-manipulated kind of stuff. It's not exactly easy listening, of course, but it's some creative, unique, and surprisingly pretty engaging stuff, if you ask me. Or you could also start here. This is partially a compilation, from what I can tell, including some tracks from the debut given proper titles, and other tracks from other obscure releases. But it's probably the single easiest to Nacht to get into. Has a similar appeal to some of the weirder Mathematics and Norkin tracks. Weird sort of creepy analog ambient stuff with generally more pronounced melodies than the more abstract stuff on Seps Vents. Probably my favorite mainline Nacht album overall. If you only want to listen to one Nacht album, I would most highly recommend this one. These are remix albums. Nothing amazing in my opinion, but check out if you're curious. And this is a pretty decent EP here as well, more abstract kind of stuff. It's cool. Right, this album marks a turn in sound for Nacht, going towards a much smoother, lighter, more meditative ambient sound. I don't listen to it all that often, as I believe he has more interesting stuff in this vein, but cool stuff here regardless. Okay. As you can see by the storm of album covers next to me right now, he has a whole bunch of one-track albums. All the ones I'm showing next to me here right now are included in his Sacraments Council Limited Edition USB, though there are other ones that I'm not mentioning. These one-track albums, they vary in quality. Some were quite interesting, some didn't really have all that much going on, but all were pretty distinctive and immersive listens. I think my two favorites are Ephemeral and Eunthigive Forest, or however you say that. Oh yeah, almost forgot about these collaborations with Solipsism. These are pretty cool. Between these two, I prefer the Serenarian Sea. Ah yes, and this trilogy of collaborations with Ishk, very Pete Namlook-esque kind of stuff, and honestly excellent all around. Definitely worth checking out. Right, finally going back to solo Nacht albums, this is among my favorites from him, again sticking to this sort of Namlook-esque meditative and smooth and spacey ambient sound that also characterizes some of his stuff with Autumn of Communion. It's a really relaxing trip here, and I've returned to it a fair bit. This was his last mainline Nacht album that had more than one track, was trying for a return to the analog kind of sound that characterized his earlier work, and I thought it was pretty good. I haven't returned to it much as I'd like, runs maybe a little long for my liking, but it's got a decent variety, it's good for what it is. I would say it's worth checking out. Which brings us to here, and okay, I will admit I don't exactly have glowing reviews for everything he's released under the Nacht name, but I don't think Lee Norris has ever released anything I can truly say I didn't get any enjoyment out of. Obviously, I'm not expecting other people to check out everything he's ever released. Of course, make sure you check out his Italian Works compilation under his real name Lee Anthony Norris, which gives you a really effective preview of all his ambient material, not just his Nacht, but under a lot of those collaborations I mentioned earlier. Right. That's a ton of prelude, as per usual, but it is what it is. Now it's finally time to talk about this new album here, Nimik Kon, and I feel like this one is specifically worth the mention because it's one of my favorites from him in a long time. One of his strongest and most engaging Nacht releases since maybe even Broad Tape Band. There so far hasn't been a Nacht album that really sounds like this. It's a lot closer to the stuff he does under the Metamatics and Norkin aliases, it just so happens to not have much in the way of drum beats. Everything was done using old-school analog synthesizers and step sequencers, and he dedicated the album to the memory of Konrad Schnitzler and Edgar Froese of Tangerine Dream fame. Also, the former of which I believe is where the Kon in the title comes from, since Konrad Schnitzler had a habit of putting a C-O-N in the title of most of his albums. I'm admittedly not very up-to-date on my Konrad Schnitzler, to be honest. I've heard a small sampling of his stuff, but just from what I've heard, this does very much seem to be a faithful tribute to the sound those guys made in the early 70s. Very old school kind of stuff, with all the old synthesizers giving off this antiquated but still vaguely futuristic sort of feel that you could get out of all those early Tangerine Dream releases. But it is very much a Lee Norris project. Sure, the synth tones are harsher, but the way he programs them does mainly remind me of the sounds I could hear on projects like Soul Static Bureau. The melodies are a lot more focused on and on point than I'm used to out of Nacht projects. It's also a lot more rhythmic as well. Some of these tracks have light drum textures to carry the beat more, and even the ones that don't all have a strong pulse to them. The music feels like it's moving, and it's giving me some vague 90s IDM vibes in some areas too. From an individual track basis though, I'll admit there isn't a lot to talk about. These tracks are all distinct and work in their own right, from the harsher and more driving tones of tracks like Cytolopper or Unreadable, which gets your foot tapping a bit more, to the more pastoral and nostalgic ambient vibes of other tracks like the mysterious Nemmit, the dramatic but stripped back Nemmit, or especially Spreyton Thatch, in which the beat has a bit more bounce to it, and it's like one of those movie flashback scenes where the kids are like skipping through a park, albeit with an electronic filter, is possibly shown on the album cover here. But the entire album does have one very unified sound. There's no track that feels entirely ambient or entirely beat-driven, certainly nothing that could have fit on, say, the Body Pop album. And everything does have that kind of nostalgic vibe. On top of all the old-school synth programming, there's a lot of really, like, lo-fi orchestral sort of sounds. Very similar to the kind you'd find on something like Kraftwerk's Radioactivity or Trans-Europe Express. Nemmit, for instance, has some prominent flute-like sounds, and Spreyton Thatch has more pronounced strings, but like I said, really lo-fi variations thereof. Like it was played on a Vaco Orchestron or some similar type of equipment. Again, trying to call back to the 70s styles of electronic music. Don't quote me on the equipment, I'm not very much of an equipment geek. Very pleasant and nostalgic presentation with melodies that do resemble those of previous Metamatics or Norkin projects. Now, With that said, despite that vague melodic resemblance, this album would not have worked as a Metamatics or Norkin project. For one thing, the grooves aren't quite strong enough and the melodies aren't quite as pronounced as they would be on a Metamatics or a Norkin album. I mean, they're more so than most Nacht projects, but the album is still clearly more about setting a consistent vibe than it's concerned with creating individually memorable tracks. None of these melodies are the kind that I can easily get stuck in my head. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. That's why it makes sense under the Nacht name. Now as for other issues, I do think the album ends on a less than satisfying note, especially when including the 3 Bandcamp exclusive bonus tracks, which are basically all just alternate versions of other tracks on here, making the whole album feel even samey and run a bit long for its own good. Stopping at track 10 was a good place to finish, although track 10 itself, Conzeal, is like a really weird experimental atonal kind of thing. I don't know, I guess it works, but not precisely ending on the strongest of notes there either. And on the topic of the bonus tracks, I do kind of wish the album had only one version of each track. The alternate versions in the bonus tracks I can tell apart, but they're not exactly so different that it's super worth noting. And there are 2 nearly identical versions of Nemmit in the main bulk of the album. Though by the same token, that particular track I found to be rather short and to be one of the better ones, so I don't totally mind its, like, near straight reprisal. But whatever. Regardless, this is one of my favorite Nacht or Lee Norris projects in quite some time. What mainly stood out to me here was the nostalgic atmosphere, which was very well executed, and the fact that we don't yet have a Lee Norris project that sounds quite like this one. I think it's quite unique for him, but also the kind of thing he would do, and I was impressed enough by it and gave me enough discussion material to make a full video on it, obviously. I would say this one's definitely worth picking up, and I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.